I arrived exactly 47 minutes late, standing outside the wooden door, snow melting beneath my heels. I heard my mother toasting my absence. Then my sister laughed, her words freezing my blood. Once the money hits the account on Monday, that house is mine. Nobody objected, not a single person. I bought that house. I paid every bill. This Christmas Eve was no reunion. Tonight, they signed their own ruin. My name is Taylor Evans. I am 34 years old, and I was exactly 47 minutes late to my own execution. Of course, I did not know it was an execution at the time. The drive to the old brownstone in Providence had been agonizingly slow, a grueling test of patience that mirrored the last few years of my life. A massive multi-car pileup had choked off the entire main route leading into the Federal Hill District. The snow was falling in thick, relentless sheets, blowing sideways and coating the windshield faster than the wipers could violently throw it aside. I sat in the idling traffic for over an hour and a half, gripping the cold leather of the steering wheel until my knuckles turned a stark white. I spent the time staring at the blurry red taillights bleeding into the dark winter night, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic ticking of the turn signal. On the passenger seat next to me rested a heavy, meticulously wrapped rectangular box. It contained a bottle of vintage wine that cost more than my first car, a peace offering wrapped in silver paper and a crimson bow. I had spent the entire agonizing commute trying to convince myself that this Christmas Eve invitation from my parents was a genuine olive branch. We had been locked in a bitter, suffocating Cold War for months. The silence between us had been heavy, a physical weight in my chest, punctuated only by passive-aggressive text messages, thinly veiled insults from extended relatives, and unanswered phone calls. But it was Christmas. In the movies, families are supposed to mend fences on Christmas. I wanted to believe that the beautifully handwritten card meant they actually missed their daughter. I wanted to believe that the bitter chill had finally thawed and we could go back to being a normal family. I was a desperate, hopeful fool. When I finally managed to wedge my vehicle into a snow-packed parking spot 2 blocks away, the frigid air bit into my lungs like shattered glass. I grabbed the heavy gift box, pulled the collar of my wool coat tighter around my neck, and began the trudge toward the house. I walked up the familiar, uneven stone steps of the brownstone. I knew every crack in these steps. I had bought this house. I had picked out the brass fixtures, paid a fortune for the slate roof repairs, and signed the endless stack of mortgage documents that kept a luxurious roof over their heads. Yet, as I stood on the porch, my leather boots sinking into the wet, accumulating snow, I felt like a stranger trespassing on private property. The house looked like a postcard. Wreaths hung in the windows, and the soft glow of interior lights painted the falling snow gold. The heavy, solid oak front door was cracked open just a fraction of an inch, likely a deliberate choice to vent out the stifling heat from the roaring marble fireplace I had personally paid to restore. Warm, golden light spilled out onto the icy porch, cutting a bright line across the darkness. I could hear the low, sophisticated hum of classic Christmas jazz playing over the expensive sound system, the sharp clinking of fine crystal glassware, and the muffled, cheerful chatter of over a dozen guests. I reached out. My gloved fingers hovered mere inches from the freezing brass doorknob. I closed my eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and prepared to paste on a forgiving, placating smile before stepping into the warmth. Before my fingers could make contact with the metal, the chatter inside abruptly died down. The sharp, clear, commanding sound of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute sliced cleanly through the jazz music. It was my father. I froze instantly, my hands suspended in midair as if caught in invisible amber. If I could have everyone's attention for a moment, my father's voice boomed from the foyer. It was rich, theatrical, and full of a jovial warmth he rarely ever directed at me anymore. I want to propose a quick toast before we eat. There was a collective rustle of expensive fabrics and the distinct sound of multiple glasses being raised. I held my breath, the cold air stinging my nostrils, expecting a generic, sentimental holiday blessing about health and family. Instead, my father chuckled. It was a deep, satisfied, conspiratorial sound. "It is great that she did not come." The words hit me like a physical, heavy blow directly to the center of my chest. My lungs seized entirely. I could not exhale. The snowy night around me seemed to instantly drop another 20 degrees, a chorus of light. Easy laughter rippled through the crowded room. Among the voices, I heard the distinct, shrill, unmistakable giggle of my mother. She was laughing. My own mother was laughing in agreement at a toast celebrating my absence. Then, a softer, infinitely more poisonous voice drifted effortlessly through the narrow crack in the heavy wooden door. It was Miranda, my older sister. Her tone was dripping with that sickeningly sweet coating she always utilized right when she was slipping a knife between your ribs. "Even better," Miranda purred smoothly, the smile evident in her voice. "We do not have to act in front of her. Next week, everything is done." I shifted my weight infinitesimally, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and leaned closer to the gap between the heavy door and the frame. My heart was pounding a frantic, bruising rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was completely, terrifyingly clear. Like a frozen lake, through the sliver of golden light, I could see a wide section of the grand foyer. The room was filled with people I recognized: extended aunts and uncles, old family friends who had known me since I was a toddler, wealthy neighbors. What struck me with the force of a freight train was not just the venom in what was said, but the absolute lack of surprise in the audience. No one gasped in shock. No one looked uncomfortable or averted their eyes. Several guests were actively nodding along, sipping their amber drinks with knowing, sympathetic smiles directed at my sister. A woman I had known since childhood, someone who used to bake me cookies, offered Miranda an encouraging, gentle pat on the arm. They were all entirely in on it. Whatever fabricated story my family had been spinning about me, whatever vicious, twisted narrative they had constructed over the last 3 months to justify their actions, this entire room had bought it wholesale. I had been systematically painted as the cruel, controlling villain in the very house that I legally owned and maintained. A lesser woman might have kicked the heavy oak door completely open right then. A more emotional daughter might have stormed into the crowded foyer, hot tears streaming down her freezing face, screaming at the top of her lungs for an explanation. I felt a fleeting, incredibly violent urge to hurl the expensive vintage wine straight through the decorative stained glass window above the door. But the fiery urge vanished as quickly as it had arrived, instantly replaced by a profound, glacial numbness that spread from my fingertips to my core. I did not cry. I did not storm in. I did not rebel. I did not move a single muscle that could betray my presence in the shadows. The dutiful, desperate woman who constantly sought their approval and funded their lifestyles died quietly right there on that icy Providence porch. Slowly, deliberately, moving with the precision of a ghost. I took a single step backward into the snowfall. I lowered the heavy, beautifully wrapped box and set it gently on the snowy, bristled welcome mat. I placed it there with the exact same finality as placing a bouquet of flowers on a fresh grave. It was the absolute last illusion of family I would ever carry for them. I reached deep into my wool coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were incredibly steady, void of any tremble. I swiped the illuminated screen, opened the voice memo application, and firmly tapped the bright red record button. I held the sleek device close to the crack in the door, letting the microphone capture the truth. Inside, the conversation flowed on, completely oblivious to the digital witness waiting patiently in the freezing dark. Once the money hits the account on Monday, Miranda's voice carried clearly over the background noise, sounding arrogant, victorious, and completely secure. "That house is officially mine." I let the recording run. I captured the low murmurs of agreement, the festive clinking of glasses celebrating a successful, massive theft, the sickening sound of my own parents orchestrating my financial ruin with a room full of willing accomplices. I stood in the freezing cold and recorded every single damning syllable until the classic jazz music swelled up again in the background and the conversation seamlessly shifted to mundane holiday trivialities and the quality of the catered food. I firmly pressed stop, the audio file instantly saved to the secure cloud. I slipped the freezing phone back into my pocket, turned my back on the warm, golden light spilling from the beautiful home I had literally built for them, and walked down the slippery stone steps. The snow was falling much harder now, acting as a white blanket, burying my physical footprints as I made my way back down the dark street to my vehicle. I unlocked the car, slid into the freezing, stiff driver's seat, and slammed the heavy door shut, locking the brutal winter out. The sudden silence inside the dark cabin was utterly deafening. I sat in the darkness for a long, quiet moment, watching the thick snow rapidly pile up on the cold windshield. The pain was certainly there, a dull, agonizing ache radiating out from the center of my chest, but it was being rapidly suffocated by a rising, unstoppable tide of cold, calculated resolve. They thought I was just a walking, breathing checkbook. They thought my desperate need for their love and approval made me completely blind to their bottomless greed. They had tragically mistaken my deeply ingrained sense of duty for pathetic weakness. I pulled my phone out again and scrolled through my list of contacts until I found her name. I pressed call and lifted the cold glass device to my ear. It rang exactly twice before a sharp, hyper-professional voice answered the line. "Evans, it is late on a holiday. Tell me this is an absolute emergency." I stared blankly at the glowing, distant facade of the brownstone through the snow-streaked glass of my windshield. I did not bother to greet her. I did not wish her a Merry Christmas or apologize for the late hour. "Elise," I said, my voice sounding as flat, emotionless, and unyielding as the black ice coating the roads of Providence. They just confessed without knowing it. 3 months before that freezing December night, I was still holding the precarious title of the most reliable person in the Evans family. It was a heavy, exhausting crown I had worn since I was a teenager. I was the capable one, the pragmatic daughter who built a solid career, kept her emotions neatly compartmentalized, and made excellent money. Above all, I was the designated sweeper. Whenever someone made a mess, I was the one expected to quietly show up with a broom and a checkbook to clean it up. My professional life demanded nothing less than absolute precision. I served as the director of vendor compliance at North River Civic Systems. It was a fiercely competitive, rapidly expanding infrastructure firm where multi-million-dollar government contracts were won or lost on the fine print. My entire reputation was built on a singular, unyielding trait I never, under any circumstances, missed a risk on paper. I hunted down discrepancies, flagged bloated invoices, and foresaw financial disasters months before they could impact the company. I was paid extremely well to see the truth that others tried to bury under glossy presentations. 2 years prior, I had foolishly allowed that professional success to bleed into my personal obligations. I used a significant portion of my savings and secured a massive mortgage to purchase and completely gut-renovate a beautiful, historic 3-story brownstone. The explicit intention was to provide my aging parents with a stable, luxurious place to retire without the constant anxiety of rising rent or maintenance costs. I kept the deed firmly in my own name, a small shred of self-preservation, but I gave them the run of the primary and lower floors. My older sister, Miranda, was granted the expansive, light-filled garden-level space entirely rent-free. She needed a headquarters for Velvet Ash Atelier, her supposedly elite boutique wedding planning and event design studio. If you looked solely at her social media presence, Miranda was a visionary. Her feed was a flawlessly curated stream of elegance. You would see her arranging imported white hydrangeas, adjusting the placement of bespoke linen napkins under warm amber candlelight, and posing in tailored silk blouses while looking thoughtfully at fabric swatches. She sold the dream of effortless, affluent romance. The reality existing outside the borders of her phone screen was a waking nightmare. Behind the aesthetic facade, Velvet Ash Atelier was rapidly suffocating under a mountain of federal tax liens. She was chronically late paying her essential vendors, burning bridges with every premium caterer and florist in the tri-state area. Even worse, she was actively dodging furious phone calls from former clients who were threatening brutal litigation over breached contracts and canceled services. The dam finally broke on a suffocatingly humid Tuesday afternoon in late September. My parents had summoned me to the brownstone under the vague pretense of a family dinner. I arrived straight from the North River offices, still wearing my tailored charcoal suit, expecting a mundane evening of pot roast and passive-aggressive comments about my work schedule. Instead, I walked into an ambush. My father was pacing the length of the Persian rug in the living room, a glass of scotch clutched tightly in his fist. My mother sat stiffly on the velvet sofa, her hands completely wrung out in her lap. Miranda was stationed by the marble fireplace, clutching a leather-bound folder like a shield, her eyes wide and perfectly brimming with manufactured panic. There was no dinner cooking. There was only a desperate, synchronized demand for a rescue operation. They sat me down and presented the crisis. Miranda was on the verge of total, catastrophic bankruptcy. Her business accounts were frozen, and she was going to lose everything unless she could secure an immediate, emergency commercial line of credit. The bank was willing to approve the loan, but only with a heavily qualified guarantor. They needed someone with a flawless credit history, substantial liquid assets, and a high-income threshold. They needed me. They wanted me to co-sign a legally binding credit agreement for $220,000. My father framed it as a temporary bridge, a minor formality. My mother framed it as my absolute moral duty to save my own flesh and blood from public humiliation. Miranda simply looked at me with those wide, tear-filled eyes, playing the victim of a harsh, unforgiving economy. I did not immediately say no. The ingrained habit of being the family savior was a hard reflex to break. However, the North River compliance director inside my head demanded verification. I told them I would consider signing the paperwork on one strict, non-negotiable condition. I needed complete, unfettered access to Miranda's accounting software and her business bank statements for the past 18 months. Miranda immediately recoiled, her tearful expression flashing into hot anger, arguing that it was a violation of her privacy and her proprietary business secrets. But my father, desperate for the money, forced her to hand over her laptop. I sat at the heavy mahogany dining table. The house was dead silent except for the rapid, sharp clicking of my mouse. I needed less than 1 hour to completely dismantle the illusion. It was not a business going through a rough patch. It was a slow-motion financial crime. The ledgers were a chaotic, terrifying mess of commingled funds. I found staggering expenses labeled as brand research that were actually luxury weekend trips to coastal resorts. There were pages of grossly inflated vendor contracts that looked suspiciously like they had been mocked up on a home printer to justify massive cash withdrawals. The most damning discovery, however, was her handling of client retainers. When a couple paid a 50% deposit to secure their wedding date for the following spring, Miranda did not place those funds into a protected escrow account. She did not allocate a single dollar toward the operational reserves required to actually execute their event. Instead, she used the new deposits to aggressively pay down the aggressive debts she had incurred from weddings that took place 6 months prior. She was robbing Peter to pay Paul, funding a lavish personal lifestyle on the backs of unsuspecting brides. It was a classic, unsustainable Ponzi scheme wrapped in expensive tulle. I closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a gavel striking wood. I looked up at the three of them. I laid out exactly what I had found, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I explained the misappropriation of funds, the fraudulent expense reporting, and the absolute mathematical certainty that injecting $220,000 into this black hole would only delay her eventual criminal prosecution by a few months. Then, I looked directly into my father's eyes and delivered the verdict. I refused to sign. The explosion was instantaneous and violent. My father slammed his heavy fist down onto the polished mahogany table so hard the crystal coasters rattled against the wood. His face twisted into a dark, ugly shade of crimson. He accused me of abandoning my sister in her darkest hour. shouting that family was supposed to endure financial risks together. My mother immediately burst into loud, theatrical tears. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice breaking as she labeled me a cold, calculating machine. She cried out that I was a heartless person who cared more about spreadsheets and legal liabilities than the blood running through my own veins. She wailed that my corporate success had stripped me of my humanity. But it was Miranda who delivered the truest, most venomous strike. She did not yell. She crossed her arms over her chest, her carefully constructed panic completely vanishing, replaced by a cold, arrogant sneer. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. She told me that I never actually cared about helping anyone. She said I only liked playing the generous, wealthy savior as long as it kept everyone beneath me. According to her, I was only willing to be the good guy if every single aspect of our lives remained strictly under my iron-fisted control, because I could not control her creative vision. I was choosing to watch her burn. I sat completely still under the barrage of their hatred. I felt the last fragile threads of my familial devotion snapping one by one. That refusal was not merely a calculated financial decision to protect my own credit score. It was a monumental tectonic shift in my entire existence. It was the very first time in my adult life that I looked at the parasitic model of my family, a system designed to endlessly extract resources from me while simultaneously resenting me for providing them, and explicitly, unapologetically said no. I stood up from the table, picked up my briefcase, and walked out of the house without offering a single word of defense. I left them standing in the ruins of their own entitlement. I thought setting that boundary would force them to finally wake up and take responsibility for their own survival. I grossly underestimated them. I did not realize that by cutting off their supply of money, I had unknowingly signed the declaration of a war they were already planning to wage against me. The morning after the explosion in the dining room, I woke up long before the sun had a chance to rise. I did not shed a single tear. I made a strong pot of black coffee, opened my personal laptop at my own kitchen table across town, and systematically dismantled the financial life support system I had kept running for my family for years. It took exactly 45 minutes to sever the non-essential arteries. I logged into my primary banking portal and navigated directly to the Authorized User tab. With a single, decisive click, my mother permanently lost access to the Platinum Rewards credit card she utilized to fund her weekly spa treatments and high-end boutique shopping sprees. Next, I canceled the automatic bank drafts that seamlessly covered the premium maintenance plan for my father's imported luxury sedan. I gathered the final, unpaid invoices for Miranda's ridiculous imported floral arrangements and artisanal scented candles, forwarding them directly to her personal email address. I attached a very brief message stating I would no longer act as a silent partner funding her aesthetic delusions. I was deeply angry, but the compliance director inside me still demanded a baseline of operational stability. I was not a monster. I kept the core infrastructure of their lives completely intact. I continued to pay the exorbitant quarterly property taxes on the Providence property. I maintained the comprehensive homeowner's insurance policy, the high-speed internet, the gas, the electricity, and the municipal water bills. I ensured my parents and my sister would not freeze, starve, or face an eviction notice. I foolishly believed that this surgical separation, cutting away the luxury while maintaining the solid foundation, would force a necessary reality check without completely destroying our familial bond. I was entirely wrong. That specific decision to keep the lights on while locking away the champagne was the exact catalyst that mutated their entitlement into pure, unadulterated hatred. If I had kicked them out onto the freezing street, they could have played the ultimate martyrs. By providing them with a warm, fully funded historic home, but aggressively denying them the cash required to maintain their wealthy facade, I forced them to live within their actual means for the very first time in a decade. It was an unbearable, daily insult to their pride. The beautiful brownstone instantly transformed from a comfortable sanctuary into a luxurious prison where they were constantly reminded of their own financial impotence. A heavy, suffocating Cold War immediately descended upon us. The retaliation was not physical, nor was it a direct confrontation. It was a highly calculated, psychological smear campaign broadcasted directly to our entire extended social circle. Miranda fired the opening shots on her public social media platforms. She completely stopped posting her usual bright floral arrangements and shifted exclusively to posting stark, moody text graphics. I watched silently from an anonymous account as she posted daily quotes regarding toxic family dynamics and the deep trauma of conditional love. She wrote lengthy, poetic captions detailing how some people utilize their wealth not to uplift their loved ones, but to keep them secured on a tight, suffocating leash. She never typed my name. She did not have to. The comment sections quickly filled with sympathetic messages from extended relatives and mutual acquaintances, all praising my sister for her incredible bravery and sending prayers for her emotional healing. My mother opted for a more traditional, insidious approach through the Family Whisper Network. During her weekly Sunday phone calls with my aunts and uncles, her tone dramatically shifted from boasting about my corporate success to expressing deep, sorrowful concern for my mental state. She would sigh heavily into the receiver, lamenting that I had become entirely unrecognizable since my last major promotion at North River. She expertly painted a picture of a cold, isolated woman utterly obsessed with climbing the corporate ladder. Someone who had completely lost touch with the true, fundamental meaning of family. She convinced them my money had made me paranoid and cruel. My father played his specific part right out in the open, directly in our own neighborhood. He spent his afternoons casually leaning against the wrought iron fences, chatting easily with the wealthy neighbors I had worked so hard to impress when I bought the property. I overheard him one Saturday morning, standing on the very sidewalk I paid a service to have cleared of snow, telling the retired surgeon next door that Miranda was the true glue holding our fragile family together. He called her the emotional caretaker, the noble daughter who sacrificed her own peace of mind to manage the intense stress caused by my demanding, erratic, and controlling behavior. In the span of 4 short weeks, I was completely rewritten as the villain in the very house I legally owned. I watched the false narrative take deep, unshakable root. Aunts who used to send me glowing, affectionate birthday cards suddenly stopped returning my text messages. Cousins looked at me with cautious pity during our brief, agonizingly awkward holiday phone calls. I had been successfully cast as the tyrant of the Evans family, the wealthy monster cruelly withholding her gold from her suffering, noble relatives. I absorbed the character assassination in complete, unbroken silence. I focused entirely on my vendor risk assessments at the office, pouring my mental energy into a corporate world where verifiable facts actually mattered and emotional manipulation held absolutely no currency. I honestly thought the worst of their retaliation was simply a damaged personal reputation. I thought their punishment was strictly limited to bad-mouthing me to people whose opinions I was rapidly ceasing to care about. Then, exactly 1 week later, the carefully constructed facade slipped. It was late on a Thursday evening. I was winding down in my apartment, mindlessly scrolling through the secondary social media account. I navigated to Miranda's public profile, a masochistic habit I was actively trying to break. She had just uploaded a brand new gallery of highly stylized professional photographs. My breath caught painfully in my throat. The images were undeniably breathtaking. They featured a massive, sprawling dinner table set for at least 40 guests. The long table was draped in heavy, expensive velvet linens, adorned with towering crystal candelabras, and overflowing with cascading white orchids. It was a flawless masterclass in affluent event design. But the opulent table setting was not what made my stomach drop into my shoes. It was the background. Behind the sparkling crystal and the pristine orchids, I clearly saw the unmistakable, custom-carved mahogany wainscoting. I saw the distinct, antique brass wall sconces I had personally sourced from an estate sale in Boston 2 years prior. I saw the wide plank oak floors I had paid a small fortune to have meticulously restored. The massive photo shoot was taking place squarely in the grand parlor of my brownstone. This made absolutely zero sense. During the explosive fight over the commercial loan just weeks prior, Miranda had openly sobbed that her studio was completely frozen. She swore to my face she had zero incoming revenue. no active clients, and no capital to even purchase basic office supplies. Yet, here was a massive, highly expensive mock-up sitting right in the center of my living room, photographed by a hired professional, and blasted out to her thousands of followers as active marketing material. I did not wait until morning. I grabbed my heavy coat, drove straight across the dark city, and unlocked the heavy front door of the brownstone with my own key. The house was quiet, smelling faintly of the expensive catered food that must have accompanied the lavish shoot. I found Miranda sitting casually at the kitchen island, tapping away on her sleek laptop, a half-empty glass of expensive red wine resting next to her keyboard. My parents were sitting quietly in the adjacent living room, watching a muted television screen. I walked directly up to the marble island, pulled out my smartphone, brought up her recent social media post, and laid the glowing screen flat on the countertop right in front of her. I asked her exactly how a bankrupt business with 0 clients was casually affording thousands of dollars in imported orchids and professional event photography inside my private residence. My voice was level, quiet, and completely devoid of any remaining sibling warmth. Miranda barely glanced down at the screen. She offered a dismissive, highly patronizing smirk. She leaned back in her stool, swirling the dark wine in her glass with agonizing slowness. She smoothly explained that it was merely an unpaid portfolio building session. She confidently claimed a group of high-end local vendors had agreed to collaborate entirely for free, pooling their resources to create promotional content for the upcoming wedding season. She adamantly insisted no money had changed hands and that she was simply trying to hustle her way back from the brink of the total financial disaster I had callously left her in. It was an incredibly smooth, well-practiced lie. But she was not the one who ultimately gave the dangerous game away. I looked past her shoulder, directly into the living room. At the exact moment I asked the question regarding the money, my father had suddenly muted the television. Both he and my mother were staring straight ahead at the blank, black screen, their bodies entirely rigid. They did not turn their heads to look at us. They did not immediately interject to aggressively defend Miranda as they usually would in any conflict. Their eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen for a fraction of a second before snapping rapidly back to the television. It was the frantic, undeniable, deeply guilty micro-expression of co-conspirators suddenly realizing the authorities were asking the wrong questions but getting dangerously close to the right answers. A cold, incredibly sharp realization pierced through the thick fog of our petty family drama. The extravagant floral arrangements, the smear campaign, and the vague social media quotes were just a loud, colorful distraction. Miranda was not merely lying about her lack of funds to gain public sympathy or to punish me. The entire family was acting as a unified, silent shield for something much larger and infinitely more destructive. I looked around the beautifully lit, quiet kitchen, suddenly feeling like a complete stranger in a space I had bought and paid for. They were not just living rent-free in my house anymore. They were actively, quietly converting the very walls I legally owned into an unauthorized, highly lucrative stage for a completely different kind of performance. The text message arrived on a mundane Tuesday morning, vibrating quietly against the polished wood of my office desk. It was from Bri Cole. Bri and I had been close friends since our university days, and as a highly sought-after interior designer, she possessed an eye for detail that bordered on the obsessive. Her message contained no greeting, only a single hyperlink accompanied by a brief question asking if I had seen the new boutique venue opening across town. I clicked the blue text. A sleek, beautifully minimalist web page loaded on my monitor. The header proudly displayed the name Morningside House in an elegant, serif font. Beneath the logo, a carousel of high-resolution images began to slowly cycle. I only needed to see the first 3 photographs to feel the blood completely drain from my face. The initial image showcased a sweeping wrought iron staircase. I knew the exact weight of the custom brass handrail because I had spent weeks arguing with a metal fabricator over the specific alloy finish. The second photograph highlighted the intricate, multicolored stained glass window illuminating the main foyer, a piece I had carefully protected during the extensive renovations. The third image was a wide shot of a glowing, pristine marble fireplace, It was the exact mantel I had painstakingly selected from an architectural salvage yard in upstate New York. It was not a similar property. It was my property. I scrolled down the page, my hand suddenly trembling against the mouse. The marketing copy was exceptionally persuasive. It described the location as an exclusive, privately owned historic estate available for intimate gatherings and premium micro-weddings. A bold banner running across the bottom of the screen cheerfully announced that the venue was currently fully booked through the upcoming spring season, and they were only accepting waitlist inquiries for the late summer. A profound, icy chill settled deep into my bones. I had never, at any point, authorized the commercial use of my residential property. I had never applied for the necessary municipal zoning variances. Yet, someone was aggressively marketing my home to the public and openly soliciting lucrative event bookings. My first instinct was to drive straight to Providence and demand answers. But the compliance director inside me instantly intervened, forcefully suppressing the angry, betrayed sister. If I confronted them now, with only a website as proof, Miranda would simply delete the page, claim it was another hypothetical mock-up, and bury the evidence. I needed ironclad, undeniable facts. I needed the paper trail. I did not send a single text message to my family. Instead, I quietly left my office, walked 3 blocks down the street, and retained the services of Elise Corcoran. Elise was a ruthless, brilliant property dispute attorney who specialized in untangling high-net-worth real estate fraud. At her immediate recommendation, we brought in Noah Greer, an independent digital forensics expert who could trace financial and corporate footprints through the darkest corners of the internet. We convened in Elise's secure conference room the following afternoon. The environment was sterile, quiet, and completely detached from the messy emotional reality of my family dynamics. I laid out the situation, providing them with the website link, the address, and my absolute certainty that I held the sole legal title to the property. Noah opened his heavy-duty laptop and began a systematic sweep of the public business registries. It took him less than 20 minutes to find the first massive fracture in my sister's hidden architecture. He projected his screen onto the wall monitor. He had located a brand-new limited liability company. It was officially registered under the name Morningside House Holdings. "Look at the filing date," Noah said, his voice flat and analytical. I squinted at the projected document. The corporation had been formally established exactly 6 weeks ago. The timeline aligned perfectly with the period immediately following my absolute refusal to co-sign Miranda's desperate commercial loan. When she realized I would no longer be her personal bank, she had immediately pivoted to a completely different, incredibly dangerous strategy. Noah highlighted the next section of the state filing. The listed managing agent, the sole individual possessing the legal authority to act on behalf of the corporation, was Miranda Evans. The official registered business address was my exact residential address in Providence. "She registered a phantom company inside your house," Elise noted, tapping her luxury pen against the glass table. "But an LLC is just an empty vessel. To legally market the property and accept vendor deposits, she needs to prove she actually has the right to utilize the physical space. She needs a lease agreement, or she needs the deed." Elise logged into the county clerk's secure real estate database, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She pulled up the official chain of title for my brownstone. The system loaded the historical records, showing my original purchase agreement from 2 years prior, but there was a new, secondary entry situated right at the top of the digital ledger. A sharp, cold silence filled the conference room as the document rendered on the screen. It was a quitclaim deed. It had been officially filed and recorded with the county just 2 weeks prior. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. The document explicitly stated that I, Taylor Evans, the sole legitimate owner of the property, was voluntarily and completely transferring all my rights, title, and interest in the real estate over to the newly minted entity known as Morningside House Holdings. "I never signed that," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I have never seen this document in my entire life." Elise enlarged the final page of the scanned deed, blowing up the signature block until it filled the entire monitor. There it was, my name, written out in black ink. At a passing glance, it was terrifyingly accurate. It captured the general shape of my handwriting, the specific loops I used, and the aggressive underline I always added out of pure habit. If a busy county clerk had casually glanced at it while processing a stack of daily paperwork, they would have never second-guessed its authenticity. But I was looking at it, and Noah was looking at it. "It is a very skilled forgery," Noah stated quietly, stepping closer to the screen. "But it is not perfect. Look right here." He pointed a laser pointer at the capital letters. "Your natural signature leans forward, an aggressive right slant. This writer was focusing so hard on matching the shape that the letters are standing almost perfectly vertical. The pen pressure is also completely wrong. You sign your name quickly, creating a fluid, unbroken line with varying thickness. This ink distribution is entirely uniform, which means it was drawn slowly and deliberately. And look at the final stroke of the last name. It drags out way too far. Like someone who was painstakingly copying a model and did not know exactly when to lift the pen off the paper." I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the leather squeaking softly against the absolute silence of the room. The air felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the space. This was no longer a petty dispute over borrowed money or unpaid utility bills. This was not a misguided sister throwing a tantrum because she was cut off from the family credit cards. This was a meticulously planned felony. Miranda had not just stolen my aesthetic for a fake photo shoot, she had stolen my actual identity. She had deliberately forged a legal property transfer, manipulated the county recording system, and officially stolen the physical deed to my home. She was actively utilizing that forged ownership to solicit substantial monetary deposits from unsuspecting couples planning their weddings, booking a venue she did not legally own. The sheer scale of the betrayal threatened to completely crush me. My own sister had weaponized my name to commit real estate fraud. And given the absolute lack of surprise from my parents during the fake photo shoot incident, the terrifying probability that they were entirely aware of this scheme began to solidify in my mind. "If we do not move immediately," Elise warned, her voice cutting through my internal shock, "this is going to escalate from a quiet forgery into a massive, multi-victim financial disaster. If she signs a binding commercial contract with a real investor or an event management group using that fraudulent deed, unwinding the legal mess will take years, and your property could be locked up in litigation until you are bankrupt." I looked at the forged signature on the wall. The anger I felt previously was entirely gone, replaced by an absolute, diamond-hard clarity. My family had crossed a line from which there was zero possibility of return. "Prepare the injunction," I told Elise, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "We are going to burn this entire thing to the ground." The digital forensics expert did not simply stop at the county clerk's public database. The following morning, the investigation plunged directly into the hidden architecture of my family's digital footprint. Noah bypassed the surface-level documents and began hunting for the source material. He needed to definitively prove exactly how Miranda had obtained such high-quality templates for the forgery. The answer was infuriatingly simple and intimately invasive. It traced back to the wireless printer sitting on the mahogany desk in the brownstone's ground-floor study. Several months prior, long before the massive argument over the commercial loan, I had utilized that specific machine to scan a high-resolution digital copy of my passport, my updated state identification, and my annual property tax declarations. Noah remotely retrieved the machine's internal memory logs. He proved that Miranda had deliberately accessed the local network, navigated to the printer's hidden cache, and downloaded the encrypted files directly to her personal laptop. She had painstakingly isolated my signature block from the tax forms, blowing it up on her screen to practice tracing the loops and aggressive angles until she could replicate the muscle memory perfectly. While Noah reconstructed the digital theft, Elise physically dismantled the fraudulent quitclaim deed. She sat across from me in the sterile conference room, a magnifying loupe held tightly over the embossed stamp at the bottom of the page. The signature was a highly educated guess, Elise stated, her voice sharp and clinical. But the notary seal was an absolute, verifiable lie. She spun her monitor around to face me, displaying the official state registry for commissioned public notaries. She had cross-referenced the identification number embedded in the stamp on my stolen deed. The state database showed a massive red flag. The specific notary public attached to that registration number had allowed their legal commission to expire nearly 12 months ago. The stamp was completely legally void. Whoever had stamped that document was either grossly negligent or an active participant in the fraud. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Up until that specific hour, I had operated under the terrifying assumption that Miranda was simply utilizing the forged deed to secure event deposits and run an illegal commercial venue out of my living room. That assumption was dangerously naive. Noah managed to breach the unsecured cloud storage account linked to the newly formed limited liability company. He did not find catering contracts or floral invoices. He found a massive, heavily redacted term sheet and an exclusive memorandum of understanding. Miranda was not renting my property, she was selling it. She had successfully courted a boutique private equity firm that specialized in acquiring distressed historic properties and flipping them into luxury hospitality venues. The contract explicitly outlined their mutual intention to purchase the brownstone outright, completely bypassing the open real estate market to quickly develop a high-end micro-event venue. The private equity group, fully believing they were dealing with the sole legal owner of the corporate entity, had already executed a massive, non-refundable earnest money wire transfer to lock in the exclusive purchasing rights. Noah followed the digital money trail. The six-figure deposit hit the corporate account on a Tuesday. By Friday, it had been completely decimated. Miranda did not allocate a single cent toward property maintenance or escrow reserves. She instantly diverted tens of thousands of dollars to an aggressive boutique public relations firm to aggressively scrub her negative online reviews and flood her social media with manufactured positive press. She withdrew thousands more in cash, likely funding the luxury wardrobe she paraded around the neighborhood. But the most substantial chunk of the stolen investor funds was wired directly to a high-powered corporate defense attorney in Boston. She was actively using the stolen equity from my home to pay the legal retainers required to fight the massive fraud lawsuits filed by her previously scammed wedding clients. I sat in the conference room, desperately trying to construct a logical scenario where my parents were merely innocent, incredibly gullible bystanders manipulated by their golden child. Elise brutally severed that final emotional lifeline. She had quietly dispatched a private investigator to the Providence neighborhood that morning. The investigator returned with high-definition security footage legally obtained from the retired vascular surgeon who lived directly across the street from my property. Elise played the video file. I watched, completely paralyzed, as a sleek black luxury vehicle pulled up to my curb. 3 men in impeccably tailored business suits stepped out onto the sidewalk. And there, emerging from the heavy oak front door with a wide, welcoming smile, was my father. He shook their hands enthusiastically. He gestured proudly toward the newly restored slate roof and the custom windows. My father, the man who loudly proclaimed to the entire neighborhood that Miranda was the only one holding our fragile family together, was personally acting as the real estate broker. He led the investors inside my home, giving them a comprehensive guided tour of the asset they were about to illegally purchase. My mother was not exempt from the conspiracy. Included in the due diligence packet Miranda had forwarded to the private equity firm was a printed email chain designed to alleviate any lingering concerns about the sudden property transfer. The email was supposedly written by me. The carefully crafted text stated explicitly that I was voluntarily and happily surrendering the entire estate to my sister because I was overly consumed by my corporate career, possessed absolutely zero intention of ever getting married, and had no long-term use for such a massive family home. The tone was sickeningly sweet and highly submissive. Noah pulled the hidden metadata from the email header. The message had not originated from my phone or my corporate server. The Internet Protocol address matched the network card inside my mother's personal tablet device. Elise did not wait for my permission to initiate the counteroffensive. She immediately began aggressively dictating instructions to her paralegal. "We are filing an emergency ex parte motion for a temporary restraining order the moment the courthouse doors open," Elise declared, her fingers flying across her legal pad. "We are going to forcefully freeze every single financial account associated with that fraudulent corporation. We are lodging a formal notice of pending litigation directly onto the county title to instantly kill the title insurance and blow up the sale. We will secure a judicial mandate banning any and all commercial activity on the physical premises. And once the civil framework is locked down, I am personally hand-delivering this entire forensic dossier to the white-collar crime division of the district attorney's office." I stared blankly at the mountain of printed evidence scattered across the glass table. The sheer, staggering coordination of it all finally crystallized in my mind. I was no longer dealing with a spoiled, entitled sister and her enabling parents. I was looking at a highly functional, highly organized criminal syndicate bound by blood. They each had a specific, ruthlessly executed role. Miranda was the charismatic, aesthetic frontwoman who secured the targets. My mother was the director of public relations, fabricating the necessary emotional narratives and forging the supporting correspondence. My father was the closer, providing the patriarchal stamp of legitimacy to convince outside investors that everything was completely above board. Elise flipped to the final page of the private equity term sheet, tapping her pen against the bolded closing schedule. "They are moving dangerously fast," she noted, her brow furrowing. The preliminary deposit was just to secure the exclusivity window. The final, irrevocable transfer of ownership and the massive secondary payout are scheduled to execute simultaneously. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the printed date. My heart completely stopped. The scheduled closing date for the fraudulent sale of my home was a very specific day. It was the Monday immediately following Christmas. It was the exact same Monday my sister had cheerfully referenced in the foyer. The exact same Monday my parents had raised their crystal glasses to toast. Celebrating my absence while standing in the house they were actively selling out from under me. While Elise and her relentless team of paralegals spent the next 48 hours constructing the impenetrable fortress of our emergency legal injunction, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in my locked mail tray at my apartment. It was entirely handwritten. I recognized the elegant, sweeping cursive script immediately. It was my mother. I broke the heavy wax seal and pulled out a premium cardstock invitation. The words were perfectly centered, smelling faintly of the expensive lavender perfume she always wore. She called the upcoming holiday gathering a chance for the whole family to start over. She wrote that the winter season was far too short to hold on to bitter grievances, and that the historic house felt incredibly empty and devoid of joy without my presence. Less than 2 hours after I opened that perfumed envelope, my smartphone illuminated with a direct text message. It was Miranda. The tone of the message was completely unrecognizable from the vicious, arrogant sister who had sneered at me across the kitchen island just weeks ago. Her message was dripping with an unnatural, cloying sweetness. She told me she desperately wanted to close the terrible misunderstanding between us. She promised that if I came to dinner, she would personally bake the brown sugar pecan pie I had loved since I was a little girl. The sheer velocity of their sudden affection made my stomach violently turn. The softer their voices became, the more terrifying the situation actually was. Over the past decade, my family had meticulously conditioned me to understand their specific, unspoken language. They never deployed that gentle, forgiving tone unless they urgently needed something from me that required my physical presence and my ink on a legally binding piece of paper. The sweetness was never an apology. It was always a transaction. I brought the physical invitation and a printed screenshot of the text message to Elise the following morning. The ruthless property attorney did not see a heartwarming holiday reunion or a mother reaching out to her estranged daughter. She saw a highly calculated legal trap. Elise paced the length of her sterile conference room, tapping her expensive pen against her chin in deep thought. She speculated that the forged quitclaim deed, while highly skilled and deeply dangerous, might not be enough to completely satisfy the stringent underwriting requirements of a massive private equity firm. The buyers or their corporate title insurance company might be demanding an additional layer of security before authorizing the final, massive wire transfer. Elise theorized that the Christmas dinner was a carefully staged environment designed to ambush me with a supplementary document. They needed a liability waiver, a confirmation of property upgrades, or a vaguely worded civil consent form heavily disguised as a tax technicality. They planned to ply me with expensive vintage wine, surround me with the blinding warmth of the holiday spirit, and casually slide a piece of paper across the dining table under the guise of tying up loose ends for the upcoming year. I sat in the cold leather chair and made the hardest strategic decision of my entire life. I told Elise I was going to accept the invitation. I was not doing it because I held on to any pathetic, lingering hope of familial redemption. I was doing it entirely for tactical advantage. If I flatly refused to attend, their paranoia would instantly spike. They might panic, forcefully accelerate the closing timeline with the investors, or attempt to forge additional, irreversible documents without my knowledge. By enthusiastically agreeing to show up and eat the pecan pie, I kept them completely docile and utterly confident in their own brilliance. My attendance was the ultimate decoy. It bought Elise the exact number of hours she desperately needed to finalize the massive legal filing and secure a judge's signature on the restraining order before a single dollar moved on Monday morning. The waiting period was a grueling exercise in psychological endurance. I spent the next several days closely monitoring the digital perimeter from the safety of my office. Miranda could not help herself. The sheer thrill of her impending wealth made her incredibly reckless. She began posting a steady stream of cryptic, highly aesthetic updates on her social media platforms. She shared artistic photographs of antique brass keys resting on velvet pillows and empty crystal champagne flutes catching the winter sunlight. Her captions were littered with thinly veiled arrogance, speaking of a grand door opening and an unexpected family turning point that no one ever saw coming. She was publicly celebrating the theft of my property, while I watched in absolute, terrifying silence. But the most chilling discovery did not come from Miranda's public feed. It came from Bry, my interior designer friend, who possessed a terrifyingly vast network of industry contacts, stumbled upon a hidden digital portal. It was a secure online reservation page created for an event branded as the Holiday Preview Gala. The listed address was my historic brownstone. The event date was set for the exact same evening as my family's supposed private Christmas reunion. Bree managed to bypass the basic security protocol and pull the hidden guest list from the page source code. She forwarded the document directly to my encrypted email. I scanned the names, the blood freezing completely solid in my veins. The list was not comprised of our extended relatives or old neighborhood friends. It included high-net-worth local socialites, prominent event planners, and most importantly, the two senior managing partners of the specific private equity firm poised to illegally purchase my home. The sickening truth hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. The Christmas dinner was never simply a trap to secure a missing signature. It was an elaborate, live-action marketing showcase. My family was throwing a massive commercial gala right inside my living room, and they had explicitly invited the buyers. They desperately needed me there, physically present among the affluent crowd. They intended to weaponize my actual body. By having the legal, undisputed owner casually mingling with the guests, smiling warmly, and enjoying a slice of homemade pecan pie, they would provide the investors with the ultimate, unspoken proof that the transition of ownership was completely harmonious and undisputed. They were going to parade me around my own stolen house as the primary prop in their million-dollar con. The invitation was not an olive branch. It was a casting call for a performance where I played the compliant fool. I did not break down. I did not scream or throw my phone against the wall. I stood in my quiet apartment, staring at the printed guest list, and methodically prepared my mental armor. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to dress up in my best winter coat, drive through the blinding snow, and walk into that beautiful home. I had to look directly into the eyes of the parents who raised me and the sister who shared my childhood. knowing they were actively selling my financial future to the highest bidder. I had to let them pour the red wine, light the expensive candles, and perform their absolute masterpiece of betrayal. I had to become the perfect, oblivious audience member, waiting patiently in the suffocating warmth of the false holiday cheer, until the very moment Elise dropped the absolute legal hammer on the entire production. I sat motionless in the freezing dark cabin of my sedan, my breath pluming into white clouds against the frigid glass. I did not throw open the car door and charge up the snowy steps to disrupt their sickening celebration. That would have been a chaotic, emotional reaction, and I was entirely finished operating on their terms. Instead, I carefully attached the freshly recorded audio file of their damning toast to a secure encrypted message. I hit send, dispatching the digital confession directly to Elise Corcoran. I immediately followed it by activating the live global positioning system tracker on my smartphone, sharing my exact, pinpoint location with the entire legal team. They needed to know I was on site, holding the perimeter. Elise called me exactly 2 minutes later. Her voice possessed the sharp, triumphant edge of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She confirmed that the presiding judge had reviewed our emergency ex parte motion and officially signed the sweeping injunction at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The trap was entirely set and legally binding. The fraudulent limited liability company was completely stripped of its power to represent the real estate. Every associated financial account was frozen solid. The historic property itself was now officially designated as a disputed asset under the heavy jurisdiction of the state court. But I had not simply relied on a single civil attorney to execute this strike. Noah Greer, our brilliant digital forensics operative, had spent the previous 24 hours planting secondary, highly explosive charges beneath my sister's house of cards. He had compiled a massive, undeniable digital dossier proving the brownstone was being utilized as an illegal, unlicensed commercial event space. He bypassed the standard bureaucratic delays and forwarded the entire package directly to the Municipal Licensing Board and the City Fire Marshal. Furthermore, Elise had successfully contacted one of the wealthy, deeply furious brides Miranda had previously defrauded. That young woman had eagerly volunteered to act as a cooperating witness, submitting a formal sworn grievance to the State Economic Crimes Task Force detailing the misappropriation of her massive wedding deposit. I sat in the cold darkness and watched the illuminated windows of my house for over 20 long, agonizing minutes. The festive shadows moved gracefully across the drawn curtains. They were completely oblivious. They were drinking expensive vintage wine, laughing at my expense, and finalizing the theft of my entire financial future. Then, the heavy, suffocating snowfall was abruptly pierced by the frantic, strobe-like flashing of red and blue emergency lights. They did not arrive quietly. 3 distinct government vehicles turned sharply onto the narrow, snow-packed street, their tires crunching loudly against the ice. A heavy county sheriff cruiser took the lead, followed closely by the bright red, oversized utility vehicle of the municipal fire inspector. Trailing right behind them was a sleek, dark, unmarked sedan belonging to the Financial Investigation Unit. They boxed in the expensive luxury cars belonging to the private equity investors, completely blocking the street. 4 uniformed officers and 2 plainclothes investigators stepped out into the blizzard. They did not walk with the hesitant, polite steps of unexpected holiday guests. They moved with the aggressive, synchronized purpose of a coordinated raid. I cracked my car window just enough to let the freezing air and the sharp sounds of the street filter inside. I watched them march heavily up the stone steps I had paid to repair. They did not search for a doorbell. The lead sheriff deputy raised his heavy, gloved fist and pounded violently on the solid oak door. The sound echoed down the quiet, affluent street like rolling thunder. I stepped out of my car, the cold wind whipping my coat around my legs, and followed them up the walkway, remaining a few paces behind, hidden in the swirling snow. The heavy door swung open. A well-dressed, incredibly confused guest stood in the threshold, holding a half-empty crystal flute. The deputy did not ask for permission to enter. He simply stepped forward, using his sheer physical bulk to force the guest aside, and crossed the threshold into the blindingly bright, overheated foyer. The other 5 officials immediately flooded in behind him, fanning out and taking absolute control of the physical space. The elegant, sophisticated holiday illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. Someone abruptly killed the sound system. The smooth, cheerful jazz music was severed right in the middle of a saxophone solo. A sudden, terrifying, graveyard silence violently suffocated the crowded room. Guests froze exactly where they stood, their faces draining of color as the flashing emergency lights outside cast frantic red and blue shadows across the pristine white walls. Through the wide-open doorway, I had a perfect, cinematic view of the absolute destruction. Miranda was standing near the center of the grand parlor. She was entirely paralyzed, completely rigid, positioned right next to an elaborate, wildly expensive architectural model of the proposed micro-event venue she was actively trying to sell. Her manicured hands were hovering over the miniature banquet tables, her confident, arrogant smile completely wiped from her face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. My father was the first to break the heavy silence. He practically threw his expensive Scotch glass onto a side table and charged aggressively toward the center of the foyer. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. He began waving his arms wildly, shouting at the top of his lungs, desperately attempting to project authority. He demanded the officers leave immediately, screaming that this was a private residence and a completely absurd, internal family misunderstanding that did not require a ridiculous police presence. The towering sheriff deputy did not even flinch. He looked at my father with the cold, bored expression of a man who dealt with wealthy, lying criminals every single day. He raised a thick, official document stamped with the heavy seal of the state court. He did not lower his voice to protect their dignity. He read the mandate loudly, ensuring his booming voice carried to the very back of the crowded parlor. He explicitly stated that he was serving an emergency judicial order regarding the heavily disputed ownership of the physical premises, stemming directly from severe, highly credible allegations of felony document forgery and real estate fraud. The word forgery hung in the warm, cinnamon-scented air like a live grenade. My mother instantly resorted to her most practiced, reliable weapon. She clutched her pearl necklace, her knees buckling slightly as she gasped for air. She attempted to play the frail, deeply insulted, aristocratic matriarch whose sacred holiday gathering was being brutally violated by overzealous thugs. She looked pleadingly around the room, expecting the wealthy guests to rush to her defense and comfort her. Absolutely no one moved to help her. The social dynamics of the room violently reversed in real time. A tall, silver-haired man standing near the marble fireplace slowly lowered his drink. He was the senior managing partner of the private equity firm, the exact man Miranda was trying to swindle out of a massive secondary payout. His eyes darted from the sheriff deputy to the sweating face of my father, and finally to the terrified, shaking form of my sister. The realization washed over his features, hardening his face into a mask of pure, lethal corporate fury. He realized in real time that he had not been invited to an exclusive holiday preview. He had been lured into a highly elaborate, beautifully decorated crime scene. He had been the primary target of a fraudulent asset showcase. Total panic finally broke through Miranda's paralysis. Her chest began to heave. Her eyes darted wildly, frantically scanning the sea of shocked, disgusted faces. She was desperately searching the crowd for a lifeline. She was instinctively looking for the one person who had spent a lifetime fixing her catastrophic mistakes. She was looking for me. Her desperate gaze finally swept toward the open front door. I stepped over the threshold, bringing the freezing, biting winter wind directly into the suffocating heat of the foyer. I did not storm in with tears streaming down my face. I did not scream insults or demand a dramatic apology. I possessed an aura of absolute terrifying calm, walking into the chaos as if I were the only person in the entire building who actually belonged there. Because I did. This party had never belonged to them. From the very beginning, this night had belonged to the absolute truth. The room parted for me instinctively. The guests, the investors. Even the investigators took a small step back as I walked slowly toward the center of the room. My father's jaw dropped open, utterly speechless. My mother let out a small, pathetic whimper. Miranda simply stared at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the silent, compliant bank account she had bullied for years was the exact person who had orchestrated her total destruction. I stopped a few feet away from the private equity investors. I did not look at my family. They were already ghosts to me. I looked directly into the eyes of the wealthy men who had nearly purchased my stolen life. My voice was quiet, incredibly steady, and sharp enough to cut through solid bone. You were just invited to a property that the legal owner never authorized for sale. In that single, crystalline moment, my family lost everything. They did not just lose the massive financial windfall. They did not just lose the beautiful historic house they had stolen. They lost the carefully constructed, elaborate lie they had spent months feeding to the entire world. The heavy velvet curtain violently collapsed, leaving them standing completely naked and exposed in the blinding light of their own devastating greed. The sun rose on Christmas Day not with peace, but with desperate, flailing retaliation. By 8 o'clock in the morning, my phone was saturated with notifications. Miranda had chosen her battlefield. She uploaded a highly produced, heavily filtered video to every single one of her public profiles. She was sitting on the floor of her bedroom, wearing an oversized sweater, her face completely devoid of makeup, tears streaming down her cheeks. For over 15 minutes, she sobbed into the camera lens, spinning a magnificent, horrifying fairy tale. She claimed I had hired off-duty officers to crash her intimate holiday gathering simply because I was consumed by a bitter, lifelong jealousy of her entrepreneurial success. She painted herself as the radiant, hard-working visionary who was being systematically crushed by a cruel, wealthy sister who could not stand to share the spotlight. While Miranda performed for the digital masses, my parents deployed their own coordinated strikes. My mother spent the entire holiday morning systematically dialing every single aunt, uncle, and distant cousin in our expansive family tree. Her voice trembled with manufactured grief as she diagnosed me over the phone. She whispered that my high-pressure corporate job had finally broken my fragile psyche. She told them I was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown, completely obsessed with controlling the family, and entirely detached from reality. My father, however, opted for a much darker, far more destructive route. He attempted to burn my professional sanctuary to the ground. Shortly before noon, an anonymous email landed in the primary inbox of the Human Resources Department at North River Civic Systems. The message was long, grammatically chaotic, and deeply venomous. It heavily implied that I was utilizing my executive position to ruthlessly intimidate my own family, hinting at severe ethical violations and describing my behavior as highly unstable and dangerous to the corporate culture. They fundamentally misunderstood the arena they had just entered. They were fighting with emotions, rumors, and theatrical tears. But risk management, evidentiary procedures, and an unbreakable chain of custody were the exact things I breathed every single day. That was my kingdom. I did not log onto social media to defend myself. I did not type a single angry comment or post a rebuttal video. Silence was my armor. Documentation was my sword. The very next morning, the day after the holiday, I bypassed human resources entirely and requested an immediate, closed-door meeting with the Chief Executive Officer and the General Counsel of North River Civic Systems. I walked into the glass-walled boardroom carrying a thick, perfectly organized binder. I did not show them a crying sister. I showed them the emergency judicial injunction. I laid out the certified forensic analysis of the forged property deed, and most importantly, I presented a comprehensive digital tracking report that Noah Greer had compiled overnight. The anonymous, defamatory email attempting to destroy my career had not been routed through a sophisticated proxy server. It had been sent directly from the specific wireless router located in the ground floor study of my historic brownstone. The exact Internet Protocol address matched my father's personal laptop. The corporate leadership did not just dismiss the anonymous complaint, they actively weaponized their own resources to protect me. In the highly regulated infrastructure sector, the attempted character assassination and identity theft of a senior compliance director was not a petty family squabble. It was a severe breach of internal security. The General Counsel immediately offered the full weight of the corporate legal department to assist Elise, classifying my father's email as actionable, malicious defamation. I walked out of that boardroom untouchable. With my professional life secured behind a corporate fortress, I turned my attention to the civilian casualties of my family's greed. While Elise handled the massive private equity firm, I personally requested the contact information for the very first investor who had fallen for Miranda's trap. It was not a faceless corporation, but an elderly widow. She had wired tens of thousands of dollars as a deposit months prior, believing she was securing an exclusive venue for her granddaughter's upcoming spring wedding. I did not send my lawyer to speak with her. I called her directly. I introduced myself, completely transparent about my identity as the actual legal property owner. I spoke to her with absolute respect and quiet compassion. I walked her through the timeline, explaining exactly how my sister had forged the documents and hijacked the title. I assured the terrified woman that she was not a complicit party in a real estate fraud, but a recognized victim. I provided her with the direct contact information for the economic crimes investigator, promising her that my legal team would assist in ensuring her stolen funds were fully recognized in the upcoming criminal restitution demands. That singled-up private conversation shifted the entire tectonic plate of public opinion. The widow was a deeply respected, highly connected woman in the local community. She did not keep the truth to herself. She began speaking to her own extensive network, dismantling my mother's lies piece by piece, the narrative violently reversed. I was no longer the heartless, wealthy tyrant maliciously kicking my loving parents out into the cold winter street. I suddenly became the only responsible adult in the room. The woman who stepped in to stop a massive, predatory scam from swallowing up more innocent victims. Miranda's aggressive digital counterattack collapsed spectacularly under the crushing weight of the emerging facts. The tearful video she had posted on Christmas morning rapidly turned into a digital liability. As the real story began to circulate through the community, the tone of her comment section shifted from absolute sympathy to intense, hostile interrogation. People began asking highly specific, incredibly damaging questions. They demanded to know why she was hosting a commercial gala in a residential home she did not legally own. They asked for the name of the title company that supposedly processed the transfer. They questioned where the wedding deposits had actually gone. Miranda panicked. She frantically began deleting comments, which only fueled the public outrage, until she was finally forced to deactivate her entire social media presence completely. The balance of the entire story changed forever. I did not win the war because I screamed the loudest or cried the hardest. I won because I maintained absolute, terrifying patience. I refused to engage in their muddy emotional trenches. I simply stepped back and allowed the undisputed truth to stand up all by itself, fully supported by an unbreakable wall of paper and ink. As the winter dragged on and the legal machinery slowly ground my family's delusions into dust, the investigation plunged into much darker, far more suffocating depths. I had mistakenly believed the forged property transfer was a sudden, desperate act of financial survival born from the explosive argument we had over the commercial loan. I was tragically wrong. When Noah Greer, our digital forensics expert, continued to meticulously dissect the confiscated hard drives and subpoenaed cloud accounts, he unearthed a rotting, diseased root system that stretched back much further than the chaotic holiday season. The forged deed was not their inaugural crime. It was merely the grand finale. My name had been utilized as their personal, VIP, boarding pass for a very long time. Noah called Elise and me into the sterile conference room on a freezing Tuesday morning. He projected a new timeline onto the glass wall. Exactly 3 months prior to the failed Christmas gala, long before Miranda had even pitched the private equity firm, she had committed her first act of verifiable identity theft. Noah had traced a series of hidden financial routing numbers. Miranda had successfully applied for and opened a high-tier merchant processing account. To bypass the stringent credit checks that would have instantly flagged her own bankrupt studio. She utilized a heavily redacted copy of my personal tax records. She registered the payment gateway under a corporate name chillingly similar to North River Civic Systems, subtly tweaking the spelling to avoid immediate digital detection while borrowing the immense weight of my professional credibility. This illicit account was specifically designed to quietly siphon massive, non-refundable cash deposits from new brides, laundering the stolen funds through my pristine credit history without triggering any banking alarms. But Miranda had not pulled those confidential tax records out of thin air. She needed a physical source. The terrifying answer lay in a series of time-stamped photographs recovered from a hidden folder on my father's personal smartphone. Late last autumn, I had spent an entire weekend at the brownstone, coordinating a massive repair of the central heating system. During the chaotic back and forth with the contractors, I had temporarily stored a thick manila folder containing my home insurance declarations and property tax assessments in the antique wooden cabinet in the living room. The digital metadata told a sickening story. While I was in the freezing basement arguing with the heating and cooling technicians, my own father had quietly opened the cabinet, meticulously arranged my confidential financial documents on the coffee table, and photographed every single page with his phone. He was the inside man, the willing supplier who handed my private financial architecture directly to his favorite daughter. My mother's participation was equally systemic and far more venomous. She was not merely running a smear campaign among our distant relatives to save face. Noah uncovered a series of recorded voicemails pulled from the civil discovery process. My mother had personally dialed the personal cellular phones of two highly suspicious, furious former clients of Miranda's failing wedding planning business. These couples were actively threatening to file fraud charges. My mother's voice on the recordings was dripping with aristocratic authority and absolute maternal warmth. She explicitly lied to these desperate couples, legally guaranteeing them that I was a willing co-owner of the new boutique event space. She falsely promised that my massive corporate salary was fully backing the venture and that I completely supported the entire operation. She weaponized my hard-earned reputation to pacify angry creditors and keep the massive Ponzi scheme afloat just a little bit longer. Then, Elise delivered a strike that cut straight down to the bone. She had subpoenaed the financial records of Miranda's wealthy, oblivious fiancé. Buried deep within a prenuptial draft was a highly confidential, legally binding personal addendum. Miranda had officially signed a sworn promise to her future husband, guaranteeing she would utilize a massive, incoming real estate windfall to completely eradicate her staggering mountain of personal and business debt a full month before their luxury destination wedding. The entire fraudulent sale to the private equity firm was never a panicked, spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a coldly calculated, highly premeditated financial assassination designed to buy her way into a wealthy marriage using my stolen equity. However, the absolute darkest piece of evidence was extracted directly from Miranda's confiscated smartphone. During a deep forensic dive into her encrypted text messages, Noah isolated a brief, highly incriminating exchange between my sister and my mother. It occurred on the exact afternoon the forged quitclaim deed was successfully notarized. Miranda had texted my mother, expressing a fleeting moment of panicked hesitation regarding the legal transfer. My mother's typed response was an absolute masterclass in casual, terrifying sociopathy. She wrote, and I quote, "Just sign it exactly like her. She is always too busy. She will absolutely never notice." As the suffocating weight of the evidence became undeniably public, the fragile criminal syndicate began to violently turn on itself. My father, terrified by the looming threat of a federal wire fraud indictment, desperately attempted to construct a legal firewall around himself. He hired his own independent defense attorney and aggressively tried to separate his actions from his wife and daughter. He claimed he was merely a foolish, trusting old man who had been completely manipulated by Miranda's lies and his wife's blind devotion. He swore under oath that he had absolutely zero knowledge of the fraudulent limited liability company. Elise completely obliterated his pathetic defense within 24 hours. She submitted high-definition security camera footage acquired from the exterior of the commercial bank where the illicit corporate accounts were originally established. The The silent black and white video clearly showed my father holding the heavy glass door open for Miranda, casually sipping a cup of coffee, and standing right next to her at the teller window while she deposited the initial stolen investor funds into the fake company. He was not a manipulated bystander. He was an active, willing accomplice who escorted the bank robber directly to the vault. Recognizing that their legal destruction was absolute and unavoidable, they deployed their final, most pathetic tactic. They did not apologize. They did not express an ounce of genuine remorse. Instead, they utilized a neutral third-party mediator to blindly approach my legal team with a deeply insulting proposition for a private settlement. The mediator presented a meticulously drafted, highly confidential non-disclosure agreement. The terms were simple. If I agreed to immediately withdraw all civil complaints, permanently halt the criminal investigations, and maintain absolute silence regarding the entire ordeal, my parents and my sister would quietly pack their belongings and leave the historic property in peace. They offered me the grand prize of getting my own stolen house back, provided I allowed them to escape completely unscathed into the night. I sat across from the mediator in Elise's office and flatly, unequivocally refused. My refusal had absolutely nothing to do with emotional vengeance or petty, lingering spite. I was completely empty of those things. I refused because the horrifying discoveries of the past month had fundamentally rewired my understanding of the people who shared my blood. I realized that if I signed that confidential agreement, if I simply let them walk away to protect the absolute illusion of our family name, I would become entirely complicit in their next inevitable crime. If they were willing to systematically forge documents, steal identities, and orchestrate a massive financial fraud against their own flesh and blood, there was absolutely no limit to what they would do to a stranger. Walking away meant giving 3 proven, remorseless predators a free pass to find their next victim. I stood up from the heavy mahogany table, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and looked directly at the mediator. I told him there would be absolutely no private deals, no quiet exits, and no whispered settlements in the dark. As the final trial date rapidly approached, a profound, unshakable coldness settled permanently into my chest. I was no longer preparing to enter that imposing courtroom as a heartbroken, betrayed daughter desperately seeking answers or closure. That naive woman had died completely on a freezing, snowy porch on Christmas Eve. I was walking into the halls of justice as a surviving witness to a highly organized, predatory financial syndicate that had merely chosen to camouflage itself using the convenient, deceptive disguise of a biological bloodline. Nearly 3 months after that freezing December night, the heavy, imposing oak doors of the state courthouse finally sealed shut behind us, locking us inside a theater of absolute, undeniable facts. The sprawling civil hearing and the preliminary criminal proceedings regarding the extensive document forgery, the real estate transfer fraud, and the gross commercial deception had simultaneously reached their absolute boiling point. The air inside the courtroom was incredibly stale and suffocatingly tense. I sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, wearing a dark, tailored suit, my hands folded perfectly still in my lap. Across the wide aisle, my family sat huddled together behind their desperately assembled defense team. They looked exhausted, terrified, and entirely stripped of their affluent, arrogant gloss. Elise Corcoran did not merely present a legal case. She orchestrated an absolute methodical legal slaughter. She stood before the presiding judge and laid out a chain of evidence so dense, so mathematically perfect, that it was entirely unbreakable. We did not rely on emotional appeals. We presented the certified forensic signature analysis from an independent state expert. We submitted the official registry logs, proving the notary seal pressed onto my stolen deed had expired, nearly 12 months prior to the fraudulent transfer. We handed over the highly incriminating internal emails extracted directly from their devices, alongside the digital router data pinpointing my father's exact Internet Protocol address during his malicious corporate sabotage attempt. We also provided the sworn, completely furious testimonies from the defrauded private equity investors who had been lured into my home under completely false pretenses. But the most devastating shockwave hit the courtroom when Elise introduced our final piece of evidence. It was the digital audio file I had captured while standing completely alone in the snow. The judge authorized the playback, and the bailiff connected the drive to the central audio system. The crisp, clear sound of clinking crystal glasses filled the dead, silent room. Then came my father's booming, jovial voice, followed immediately by my mother's shrill, delighted laughter as she enthusiastically endorsed the toast celebrating my absence. The absolute, unvarnished malice echoing through those state-of-the-art speakers was so visceral, so undeniably cruel, that a heavy collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Even the high-priced, aggressive defense attorney my family had hired stopped taking notes. He slowly lowered his pen and stared down at his legal pad, completely unable to lift his head and meet my gaze. The beautiful, victimized facade my family had spent their entire lives perfecting shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the polished courtroom floor. The presiding judge was a stern, older woman who possessed absolutely zero patience for sentimental family rhetoric. The courtroom was an arena of concrete facts, and the facts demanded absolute, categorical ruin. She did not waste a single breath offering a gentle reprimand. She struck her heavy wooden gavel, officially and permanently declaring the fraudulent quitclaim deed completely null and void. The newly formed limited liability company my sister had created was ordered to be immediately judicially dissolved. Every single commercial transaction, exclusive event agreement, and financial transfer stemming from that fabricated ownership was permanently canceled and wiped from the county records. Miranda was no longer dealing with a frustrated younger sister cutting off her secondary credit cards. She was staring directly down the barrel of severe life-altering state prosecution. She faced multiple, heavy felony indictments for aggravated document forgery, massive property fraud, and extensive commercial deception. Because she had successfully negotiated and deposited tens of thousands of dollars from the private equity firm across state lines, the authorities completely elevated the charges far beyond a simple domestic dispute. It was now officially categorized as a major financial crime, carrying the terrifying potential of a lengthy mandatory prison sentence. My parents did not miraculously escape the blast radius as they had so desperately prayed they would. The court formally determined they were not innocent, oblivious bystanders manipulated by a greedy daughter. The judge explicitly cited their active participation in presenting false, fabricated narratives to outside investors. The ruling highlighted their logistical support in operating an illegal commercial venue out of a strictly residential zone, officially cementing their undeniable roles as willing, active accomplices in a highly coordinated chain of fraudulent behavior. They were held jointly liable for the massive civil restitution required to repay the defrauded brides and the furious investment firm. To ensure the severing of our toxic ties was absolute, permanent, and legally binding, the court issued a comprehensive, multi-year civil no-contact mandate. They were strictly and legally prohibited from approaching me, my current apartment, the corporate headquarters of North River Civic Systems, or utilizing my legal name or my likeness in any capacity whatsoever. The boundary I had attempted to set in their dining room months ago was now enforced by the heavy hand of the state police. As the bailiff moved to formally adjourn the session, the heavy, suffocating reality finally crushed whatever pathetic delusion Miranda had left holding her together. She completely broke down. She turned her body toward me, her face violently blotchy and completely soaked in mascara-stained tears. She lunged against the heavy wooden partitions separating our tables and frantically begged me to save her. She sobbed uncontrollably, pleading with me to drop the charges, to fix the entire disaster just like I always used to do when we were younger. She reached out her shaking, desperate hand toward me, begging for the familiar safety net of my bank account and my mercy. I did not move a single inch. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my hands neatly folded. I simply looked at her, allowing the absolute, uncompromising weight of the law to finally complete the necessary work that my own misguided pity had ruined so many times before. I watched the bailiff step forward and physically guide her away from the table. Following the absolute finality of the trial, I did not pack my bags and return to live among the heavy, suffocating memories trapped inside that historic Providence brownstone. The house no longer felt like a family home. It felt like a beautifully preserved crime scene. Instead, I hired a completely new, highly recommended team of professional contractors. We spent over 4 weeks completely gutting the entire garden-level floor. We forcefully tore out the expensive velvet curtains, the custom ambient lighting, and every single lingering, pathetic trace of Miranda's fraudulent event studio. I transformed the expansive, light-filled space into a highly functional, premium residential apartment. The heavy scent of her imported floral arrangements was permanently replaced by the sharp, clean smell of fresh paint and sanded wood. I placed the newly renovated unit on the open market and immediately signed a lucrative 2-year standard lease agreement with a quiet, reliable corporate tenant. The property was finally generating a completely clean, legitimate profit, fully severed from the parasitic drain of my bloodline. The final chapter of this grueling ordeal did not end with me standing victorious amid the fallout of my family's collapse, taking pleasure in the dramatic consequences of their own choices. There was no triumphant, cinematic celebration in my quiet apartment. There was only a profound, incredibly painful clarity. I had finally learned the absolute most brutal lesson of my entire adult life. I learned that there are certain people in this world who will only claim you as their cherished, beloved family member as long as they desperately need your house keys, your forged signature, or the unlimited, unquestioned access to your bank account. And the exact minute you finally find the courage to firmly lock that door and cut their funding, they will instantly drop the loving disguise and finally reveal their true, terrifying face. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can interact and share our thoughts. I would be incredibly grateful if you could subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.